In a few short centuries, industrial civilization had spread from the western fringes of Eurasia to sprawl across the face of the planet, plundering the soil of its riches, fouling the air, and remolding life forms at will. Just 1,000 years after its foundation, this gargantuan industrial society had already peaked. Ahead lay abrupt and violent decline. The cities burned, welling up as clouds of poison in the war remembered as the 7 Days of Fire. The complex and sophisticated technological superstructure was lost, and almost all the surface of the earth was transformed into a sterile wasteland. Industrial civilization was never rebuilt, as mankind moved on through the long twilight years. Those are the opening words to a manga written by Hayao Miyazaki, not quite what you'd expect at face value from the man behind Studio Ghibli. Now, this doesn't look or sound like a world designed by Miyazaki, right? No signs of slice of life, magic, childlike whimsy, or a warm and cozy feeling of nostalgia. Instead, these words talk about the decline of a prosperous civilization not too far removed from our own. They paint the picture of a truly broken world, full of dread and devoid of everything that most people would know Ghibli for, and sets the stage for a story during humanity's gradual but inevitable extinction. However, these initial words would be followed by what is undeniably one of the greatest stories ever told in the medium of both manga and animation, one that would contain DNA seen in every future project by Miyazaki, and by further extension, Studio Ghibli and the anime industry at large. These pages would lead to an incredibly influential anime adaptation and the forming of the most iconic anime studio ever. Join me today as we delve into Hayao Miyazaki's post-apocalyptic epic, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Nausicaa is often touted as a foundational work in regard to the Ghibli library, and justifiably so. Despite not being the official first Ghibli film, it's definitely seen as the starting point. It undeniably laid the groundwork for everything that followed, and its success led to the studio's creation. In addition, it was also Hayao Miyazaki's first original story that was translated to film, and the manga took a decade to complete, so it really does carry so many themes and ideologies that are present throughout all of his later work. However, compared to everything else that came afterwards, it truly stands out in its tone and setting. Aside from some elements in his next film Laputa and the music video for On Your Mark that he directed, he's never really been associated with post-apocalyptic or sci-fi settings. But it was far from the start of his career, nor was it his first foray into darker storytelling or a post-apocalyptic world. You see, due to the immense popularity of Ghibli, a lot of his works prior to Nausicaa have faded into relative obscurity, but Nausicaa truly was the culmination of everything his career up to that point was building towards. Born in January of 1941, Miyazaki spent his earliest years growing up in the shadow of World War II. His father was the director of an aircraft part manufacturing company. Being surrounded in this environment, Miyazaki grew to love aircraft, the beauty of how they're made, and the freedom they allow in flight. However, as he saw firsthand the destructive path Japan went down, causing their own citizens so much pain, and those abroad unfathomably more so, he grew to detest war and the violence that can be caused by such beautiful machines. This dichotomy became something that was present in almost every story he's made, and is quintessential to the world and story of Nausicaa. After growing up wanting to become a mangaka, and becoming enchanted by animation thanks to the film Hakujeiden, Miyazaki eventually got his first animation job at Toei Animation, the studio behind Hakujeiden, and started his career as an in-between artist in 1963. From there, he worked across many projects, eventually working his way up to a Dolga animator doing keyframes, across even more projects, and in 1969, he got to helm an original story for the very first time, which was a manga called Sabaku no Tami, or People of the Desert. From as soon as he could, Miyazaki made a story about the horrors of war, one about disparate tribes of people living in the deserts, inspired by Central Asia, struggling to survive, and many of them close to dying out and losing their culture entirely. In fact, it didn't look too different from where we currently are now. Later on in 1977, after bouncing between doing keyframe and direction work for various studios, Miyazaki was finally able to helm an original series of his own. This was Future Boy Conan. an adaptation of Alexander Key's The Incredible Tide. This is where a lot of key elements that would later carry on into Nausicaa appeared. It takes place after a great nuclear war that plunged the world into a dark age, features many depictions of different aircraft, and has a big focus on environmentalism. And then finally, in 1979, Miyazaki made his directorial film debut with Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro. While not quite being as relevant to Nausicaa, which I've already made a video on, it still paved the way to him directing the film adaptation of Nausicaa a few years later. And then finally, in 1982, Miyazaki began work on the serialization of the manga for Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind in the magazine Animage. And then in 1983, he began work on an anime adaptation of the first 2 volumes of Nausicaa in the form of a full-length theatrical film, his first original story to take this format. Alongside his co-worker, collaborator, and eventual co-founder of Studio Ghibli, Isao Takahata, as producer, and Topcraft chosen as the production studio, they set out over the course of 9 months to create a truly incredible and influential film. Despite being made before Ghibli, it's always been associated with the brand, and even 40 years later, still sits towards the top of their library in quality. Hell, even in this post-apocalyptic wasteland, I've got a copy of both the manga and Blu-ray that survived. It's that well beloved. Speaking of which, there's actually a lot of differences between the manga and the film. You see, as I mentioned, the film is only an adaptation of the first 2 volumes of the manga, and the manga was only completed in 1994, 12 years after it initially started, so the film only covers about a quarter of the whole story. I know, that's a lot that's not covered by the movie. I'm sure most of you have seen the film, but I'll give a quick plot summary. The story follows the titular Nausicaa, who is Princess of the Valley of the Wind, a small independent kingdom that sits on the edge of the Sea of Decay, a vast jungle with air too toxic for humans to breathe that covers most of the earth. It was created in the fallout of the 7 Days of Fire, the catastrophic event caused by the war that saw the collapse of the era ruled by humans centuries prior. Now, the world is ruled by the ever-growing forest, which is full of giant insects. As her homelands are being invaded by the Tolmekian Empire, the most powerful force in the world, and led by its princess Kushana, Nausicaa fights to protect her people and tries to stop humanity from repeating the same mistakes their ancestors did so long ago. But she also sees the Sea of Decay as beautiful and wants to protect and discover its secrets too, so she's caught in the middle of this huge conflict. Since this was an adaptation of the manga, the general plot is still very similar, but there is one key difference, and that is the context of the whole conflict with Tolmekia. You see, rather than being the direct antagonists, Tolmekia and the Valley of the Wind are actually historic allies, and the Tolmekian Empire is at war with another nation, the Doric Principalities, which are completely absent from the anime. This change affects smaller things, such as the dynamic between the Valley and Tolmekia and, by extension, Nausicaa and Kushana, but also expands the world of Nausicaa in a way that the film simply doesn't have the time or space to be able to do so. This then changes things on a much larger scale later on, since the majority of the manga takes place in the Doric lands, and the story takes place during the backdrop of this war. It'd be impossible to go through all the minute differences in how these changes impact the greater story, and I don't want to spoil the manga since my explanation could never do it justice, so I really recommend that you read it for yourself if you get the chance. But it really highlights how both the manga and anime are giving you 2 different, unique experiences that are both worth partaking in. But overall, the manga is one of the things that makes Nausicaa so unique, especially among the Ghibli library, and the fact that it's quite underread is crazy. Although, when you first hear of it, you'd probably assume it's just the film in comic form, but that isn't at all the case. It's a different beast entirely. This was the one time where Miyazaki was able to just go wild. He had no restrictions on an animated TV series, limited budget, or a single film's runtime. He was able to take breaks in publishing it whenever he needed, so he worked on it on and off throughout the decade. Usually Ghibli films are known for being quite long, but Miyazaki himself often struggles to keep the runtime for his movies down due to the medium of animated films, and there's just so much he wants to put into them. However, the Nausicaa manga truly is him with no restrictions. He's able to explore topics as deeply as he wants, go super in-depth with the world building, develop countless characters from being minor background characters to fully fleshed out individuals with arcs and relevance to the overall story, and put in tiny little details everywhere. It's probably the rawest expression you'll ever be able to see of Miyazaki as an artist. One of these key aspects is, of course, the world. Ghibli stories are known for their worlds that have so much detail and life put into them. We often get moments where the characters get to just exist in the world and reflect, sit with their thoughts for a bit. And this is so strong in Nausicaa. The relationship between people and the world they live in is the main issue of the story, how this world is dangerous for them to live in and one they no longer belong in, although people like Nausicaa are still able to see beauty in it, and by extension we are shown this as well. Geographically, the world of Nausicaa is based on the area around Turkey and the Caucasus region. This is based on a map that we're given at the start of the book. We know that it's at least based on the real world since Eurasia is mentioned, but it seems like the magnetic poles are different and the geography isn't exact compared to our world. This could be as a result of the war that took place ages before the story, but who really knows? For the people and countries of the world though, Miyazaki took a few different inspirations. He's always seemed to have a fascination of Central Asian cultures and incorporated some aspects of them into the Valley of the Wind, specifically some parts from Tibetan, Mongolian, Caucasus, and Kazakh cultures. I find this really cool. You don't often see fantasy worlds inspired by these cultures and their mythos, traditions, or clothing in media, so it only adds to the unique character of this world. Tolmekia, in contrast, is much more European and Western in design, with their hulking airships, armor, and weapons, and in the manga we get a brief glimpse of some of their cities. Whilst being a bit more generic in inspiration, Tolmekia probably acts as a bit of a surrogate to the USSR, based on its industrial nature, relationship to smaller kingdoms in the periphery like the Valley of the Wind, expansionist and totalitarian behavior, and if we take into account Miyazaki's interests and other inspirations. Additionally, in the manga, the Doric people are this really unique and cool culture that is ruled by regional monks who have supernatural abilities, but due to being a big religious country, they also have a military and their generals are also monks, and many of them climb the ranks due to nepotism and military skill, despite not having supernatural abilities or being very spiritual. The Emperor is this highly holy being who has been alive for centuries and prolonged his life with his abilities, but is seen kind of like a puppet leader to his younger brother. It kind of reminds me a lot of some other real-world countries in its structure, maybe even one that Miyazaki himself is critical of. Anyway, visually they're inspired by Jomon culture. The Jomon people lived in Japan during prehistoric times before the modern day Japanese Yamato people did. They had their own distinct culture, tools, customs, and art that we're lucky enough to uncover in the modern day, thanks to archaeologists. So their soldiers are like these ancient Jomon samurai GIs that also incorporate bug-themed armor into their designs, which is super cool and unique. And of course, I have yet to talk about the main part of the Nausicaa world, the thing that has devoured the majority of the land, the Sea of Decay. You'll probably want to put your masks on for this one, it might get a little hard to breathe. Wow, and what a dangerous but beautiful world. The Sea of Decay really can't be compared to anything else in another Ghibli film. Nothing comes close to the sheer scale of it and the complexity of how its ecosystem functions. It really is insane how we learn about the different roles that the insects can have, how different fungi grow in this forest, and how its natural goal is to purify the toxic air and soil of the world over the course of millennia. The way it's depicted completely enchants me as well, which I think was the purpose. In the film's opening credits, we are introduced to the effects of the sea on human settlements first, and how it absolutely decimates them before we see the forest itself. But in the manga, we don't get that, and instead are introduced to it through the eyes of Nausicaa. We get to see the still and calmness of it, how peaceful it can be. I think I like the film's way of doing it a little bit more, since we get to see this unique juxtaposition, but I love how it's depicted in both, and what each of the respective mediums allow. The spores and fungus have this real soft texture to them through the line art. With the manga being only black and white, Miyazaki puts a big emphasis on lighting, creating this sense of scale with how dark the forest becomes even right on the edge of it. Nausicaa gets completely enveloped in this darkness, but she still finds it very comforting. Miyazaki has spoken about this before, but in Japan, darkness doesn't have the same symbolism or feelings associated with it as it does in the West. Here, darkness is often associated with fear and danger. You may never know what is lurking and watching you from the shadows. It's almost always associated with evil. But in Japan and Shinto belief, darkness is seen with much more reverence. Japan's forests and valleys where people live are incredibly dark at night due to being nestled in between tall mountains where less sun climbs over their peaks, so people historically there have lived with darkness as being a part of their lives. After all, we need darkness to sleep properly. As a result, darkness in Japanese culture can be seen as more of a comforting and peaceful thing. And you'll still see this in modern Japanese cities, even in Tokyo. You can go from a bustling, busy, bright area such as Shibuya, but then the streets of the suburbs where people live are incredibly dark and quiet, and the transition between the two can be very fast. The same goes for the countryside. If you're ever out there walking around at night, you'll sometimes see fog drifting down the hills and over the fields, and it'll be incredibly dark, but fully with a feeling of awe and comfort. This is something that I feel is captured perfectly in the Sea of Decay's depiction in the manga. The film, on the other hand, has colour and sound design to play with. You get to hear the sounds of the forest through the insects. They sound and move so otherworldly. The forest is so dense that it blocks out sound and wind from the outside world, and the techniques and brushes that the artists use for the backgrounds really give this granular texture to it all, almost like you can see the individual dust-like spores. Colour is where that dark atmosphere I spoke of earlier comes from, but the colours themselves are quite desaturated and really remind me of early paleo art, which makes me wonder if this was at all an inspiration for Miyazaki, since the Sea of Decay really is like a futuristic, carboniferous world. At times it almost feels like a Jules Verne-esque setting, one filled with wonder and adventure, like Journey to the Center of the Earth or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But rather than focusing on the adventure and human developments that allow us to explore such a world, Nausicaa instead comments on how these things lead to destruction of a human world, and almost a forbidden beauty which we're not supposed to see, but was created as a result of our own technology and industrialization. As someone who grew up in an area with lots of rainforests quite close, he really captured the feeling that you get when you enter these ancient forests perfectly. And of course, we have the first collaboration between Hayao Miyazaki and Joe Hisaishi, an iconic director-composer duo that has continued to this very day. Being the first anime film Hisaishi worked on, while some of the scores don't quite resemble the music that he's known for with other Ghibli films, it really gives Nausicaa its own unique musical identity. It was a lot earlier in his career, and he plays around more with synths and more of a sci-fi sound at times, while still having sweeping orchestral moments that can really set the scene and make emotions swell. It adds to this whole epic feeling of the story. I don't personally know enough about music theory to really talk about it much, but it's undeniable that there was something unique here, and Hisaishi's score adds so much to the film in a unique way that the manga simply can't achieve. If you see the behind the scenes for the making of the short film Borrowed a Caterpillar, you can see that Miyazaki has always had this fascination with insects and seeing the world from their perspective. He often likes to play with scale in his films, making the worlds that his characters inhabit seem so big, and in Nausicaa he does this very literally. Despite being based on our own world, the world of Nausicaa feels so alien, doesn't resemble ours, and is hard to imagine as once belonging to humans. The forest and insects feel so otherworldly and dwarf Nausicaa as she walks through it. The clothing and masks that the people have to wear to survive here, just for a short while, adds to this feeling, covering them entirely. They almost resemble insects themselves. As people, we are forced to traverse through a world that is no longer our own, one that we lost a millennia ago due to our own hubris. This world has become actively hostile and dangerous towards us. Being small and insignificant creatures, humans themselves have become the insects of this world. But despite humans not being there, this world continues to go on, grow, evolve, change, and exist every day quietly for hundreds of years. And depending on who you ask, while travelling through the forest, you might be lucky or unlucky enough to come across the kings of the Sea of Decay, the great Ohmu. In fact, today seems to be our lucky day. There's one just over here. Now, come on, just quietly now, be careful not to alarm it. The Ohmu absolutely steal the show. They demand all attention with their huge size and bright eyes. There is definitely something scary about them, but also awe-inspiring. In the manga and film, they almost have an air of reverence around them, and dominate the frame whenever they appear. When angered, their destruction and warpath is unparalleled, but they're also able to have this incredibly gentle and sympathetic side to them. They're the guardians of the forest, and a wonder of nature in this post-apocalyptic world. The fact that Miyazaki was able to make all of us feel for a giant, faceless, bumpy, spiky isopod-like insect with all these legs and eyes and tendrils is truly a testament to his storytelling skills. Ghibli is well known for their unique and iconic character designs, often being cute or whimsical fantasy creatures, but the Ohmu sits among them and definitely stands out from the pack. Sure, Nausicaa also has Tito, but when you think of the world of Nausicaa and its story, you immediately think of the Ohmu. You simply can't have one without the other. The Ohmu are the symbol of the forest and nature in this story, and Nausicaa acts as the connection between the Ohmu and the people. The Ohmu in the forest have so much character in them, and they truly feel alive because they are. We're introduced to this world as being post-apocalyptic and devoid of life. But the truth is, this world is incredibly rich in biodiversity and simply teeming with life and wonder. But it simply isn't framed that way because of the perspective we initially see it through, and as our bias towards people. I've seen very few stories that tackle this relationship between people and nature through the depiction of the setting and world better, or even similar to the way it is done in Nausicaa. But who are the people that live and survive in this world? Let's get to know them a bit better, and who better to start with than our titular protagonist herself, Nausicaa. Nausicaa is the princess and later on queen of the Valley of the Wind. She's always cared for and is beloved by her people, but she's also always had a fondness for nature, the forest of the Sea of Decay, and the insects that live within it. Originally, Miyazaki was inspired by Nausicaa from Homer's Odyssey. He was disappointed by her inclusion in the story though, and wanted to know more about her. He then also took inspiration from The Lady Who Loved Insects, a 12th century Japanese tale about a court maiden who didn't follow conventions of the time and was amazed by insects. However, this story was kind of made as a way to show someone who doesn't fit in and what not to do. Miyazaki, though, decided to highlight these traits as a good thing. Nausicaa really is the blueprint for many Ghibli characters that followed. She shows so much compassion, empathy, and an absolute love for life and the wonder within it. This can easily be seen in how she's depicted in the manga and how she moves in the film. Nausicaa lives in harmony with nature. Unlike the Tolmekians and Dorks who use large hulking aircraft or supernatural abilities to cut through the sky or create biological weapons of war. Nausicaa instead rides the wind with her Maeve, and due to her sympathy for insects, she often has to be the peacekeeper and mediator between humans and the forest. She becomes a pacifist who tries to stop the world she loves so much from destroying itself. The film ends of course with her being seemingly killed by a stampede of Ohmu, enraged by humans being cruel to nature, but her sacrifice is what ultimately calms them, and she's revived in a biblical messiah-like fashion. Some people may argue that she is a Mary Sue type of protagonist, one of her flaws and the religious adjacent ending may support this. However, I quite thoroughly disagree. Miyazaki was not satisfied with the ending of the film, and things do play out differently in the manga. Nausicaa does not get killed by the stampede, and many times throughout the story later on, she is seen by others to be holy, but she constantly continues to just be and act human. She's even given the chance to have godlike powers or status a few times but always refuses, and in fact, the more that people see her as this messiah-like figure, the weaker she actually becomes physically. Throughout the story, there are several times where Nausicaa struggles with this dichotomy of wanting to help both people and nature, and grapples with the reality that she can't always do both. We see early on in both the film and manga that Nausicaa has the potential to be an incredibly violent and powerful warrior. She has this darker side to herself and struggles to control it at times. There are even times where she seemingly gives up. Additionally, Nausicaa was quite unique during the context of the era in which she was created. Representation of women in anime prior was pretty archetypal. They were often simply the damsel in distress or love interest. Occasionally you would have some women characters that break the mold, such as Fujiko from Lupin III being a femme fatale, but she was still very sexualized and not quite as well-rounded or fleshed out as a character. Miyazaki himself was guilty of this. After all, he created Clarice in his first film, The Castle of Cagliostro, who was little more than a damsel in distress, and is sometimes referred to as one of the first moe characters, which eventually led to the waifu culture in anime that we have today. You also had some genuine trailblazing characters, such as Princess Sapphire from Osamu Tezuka's Princess Knight in the 50s and 60s. However, she is specifically a character who disguises herself as a man in order to fill a more masculine role as a woman. Nausicaa, on the other hand, was a female protagonist that was allowed to showcase her traditionally feminine traits through her compassion, kindness, understanding, and simply being able to show emotions while still having plenty of action, being a leader, having others depend on her, and being physically and emotionally strong. She's just a well-rounded character that carries the story very well, exactly how it should be. Nausicaa is never really sexualized or treated like a damsel. She stands shoulder to shoulder with the men and other female characters in her story, and for the time it really was quite revolutionary. She really set the blueprint for many more iconic Ghibli women that came after her, and even beyond Ghibli with female protagonists throughout anime in general. There is one character in the story in particular who plays off Nausicaa so well. Their parallels, differences, and eventual respect for one another is one of the best dynamics I've seen in manga, and quite possibly one of the characters with the best development out of any Ghibli property. This would be Kushana, the princess of Tolmekia. Now, if you've only seen the film, you may be a little confused. In the anime, Kushana is little more than the antagonist of the story. Yes, she shares some moments of Nausicaa, and she does grow to respect her by the end of the film, and show a hint of development. But overall, she's just a less fleshed out version of Lady Eboshi from Princess Mononoke, in my opinion. However, she does have that wicked cool mechanical arm, can't deny that, so she does get points there. In the manga though, she is completely different. Instead of being the antagonist, she's more of the deuteragonist, if anything. She's still quite cocky and dismissive at first, but we learn that she holds a lot of respect for her soldiers and cares for them deeply. She sees them as equals. Much of the story follows Kushana and how she wants to protect and save her men. She's very similar to Nausicaa in that regard. However, where she differs is her upbringing and environment. She comes from a royal family that wants her dead, and she's been fighting her whole life simply to justify her existence. So she will do whatever it takes to justify that, using violence, backstabbing, killing. She's a person that Nausicaa has the potential to become, and they both do influence each other to some degree. Throughout the story, we see Kushana grow to become a very good leader. Instead of resorting to trickery and backstabbing like her father and brothers, she comes to respect Nausicaa and treats others with dignity. We see her go to hell and back with her men, struggling to survive in this brutal war, and she becomes so multifaceted. She's an incredibly interesting character, and much of the plot wouldn't happen without her involvement. She's similar to Lady Eboshi in how she could be seen as an antagonist, but you also fully understand why she makes the choices she does. She's another groundbreaking woman character in anime because of how deep and developed she becomes. She always has this sense of presence whenever she's involved in the story, and many of the best moments are related to her. However, despite all of this, neither Nausicaa nor Kushana are my favourite character. That honour goes to Kurotoa. He is essentially the henchman of Kushana. In the film, he doesn't really do anything, aside from being mainly aloof and then getting a small power kick when he is left alone in charge of the Valley of the Wind. But in the manga, he is a completely different character. He gives us the perspective of just a normal man caught in the middle of this massive conflict and has to work directly under these two big personalities that have the capabilities to move entire nations and change the world. He just wants to get out of it alive and have a pension at the end of the day. He's also incredibly flawed, which I love. He's pretty cocky in his own abilities, granted he is able to back them up, being a very skilled pilot, and is always trying to come up with little schemes of his own. He often is left puzzled why so many people are obsessed with Kushana and Nausicaa, but then also finds himself begrudgingly running to help them. The way he's drawn with his expressions is just so fun, and I have a feeling that Miyazaki had a soft spot for him as well. He often likes putting in these everyman type of characters in some of his stories, most infamously being his depictions of Zenigata when he worked on Lupin. Kurotoa provides some good comedic relief, but also keeps the story grounded to a degree, and has a nice little arc of his own where he becomes a really dependable ally. He's a really great and, in my opinion, underrated character. And he's just one of the many side characters in this epic. You've got great characters like Asbel, the lone surviving prince of Pedjite, who is the first person Nausicaa is able to help change and grow, and then goes on his own little adventure throughout the story. Or Yupa, who is the old master swordsman respected throughout the world, who acts as a mentor to Nausicaa and fills the role of the older generations, providing wisdom and allowing the younger generations to grow and help the world in a meaningful way for the future that he won't be able to see in his lifetime. He's kind of like a Gandalf figure, but a bit more human. There's Charuka, a militaristic general monk from the Doric side who starts out as an enemy, but later on becomes an ally and allows us to humanize and relate with the Doric side of the war better. Or even Muralipa, who is the Doric Emperor's brother, who has immense supernatural power and is this dark and evil antagonistic force throughout the first half of the story. But even he, despite his dark soul, is given the chance to find peace, thanks to Nausicaa and her sympathy for him. It's truly such a rich world full of so many unique and interesting characters. There's still plenty that I haven't spoken about here, and they're all given space to grow and stand out due to the scale of the manga, but are best to be discovered if you read the book for yourself. Now, I think it's about time I talk about the art of Nausicaa. After all, I am an artist and animator myself. For the time, the animation of the film was really good, and still holds up perfectly fine, of course. For me, it was the last Miyazaki film I saw at age 17. I was a little hesitant to watch it because I hadn't seen anime as old as that before, but a bit earlier I saw The Castle of Cagliostro, which is even older, and I absolutely loved it, so it broke the barrier I had for watching older anime, which I'd also really encourage you to, because there are some gems from back then. And for only taking about 9 months to make, it's pretty crazy how tight and good the animation is considering the scale of the film. Compared to Cagliostro, which mostly takes place inside one castle, Nausicaa was certainly the biggest project Miyazaki had tackled so far. Things like the action scenes are all so well choreographed and animated. Everything has a really good sense of weight, and the way things move in the wind feels so real. Trying to capture something that you can't physically see, like the wind, can be very difficult to make it feel grounded and realistic, or to fit with a specific art style. But the artist nailed it here. From clothing moving in the wind, to the massive spinning vanes on the road to the valley, or how Nausicaa's Maeve glides through the wind effortlessly, but then floats about on a breeze when she lets go. There are so many little details that bring the world to life. The same can be said for the Sea of Decay. These fictional, fantastical insects move in bizarre ways, but it all feels right. Most notably is the Ohmu. It stands out. Unlike everything else in the film, it's not cel-shaded. Instead, its hard shell is rendered like a background piece, and each layer of the carapace is animated independently using similar techniques to cutout animation, which makes it feel more rigid and also adds to the sheer scale of the Ohmu. But then the parts that are traditionally animated close up like its legs are also so intricately animated. They're really a wonder of the medium. It developed a production pipeline that was used later on and established many Ghibli animators' careers, which by extension established many of the industry's greatest animators, who later went on to have their own studios or original works. For example, Hideaki Anno, one of the most well-known anime directors and creator of Neon Genesis Evangelion, had his first real claim to fame animating on Nausicaa. He did the sequences with the God Warrior, which is just insane in its detail, with its flesh falling off and falling apart. And yes, the anime does not tell the whole story, and after reading the manga, you'll never be able to see it the same way again. It will always feel like there is something missing. However, I can't really say that's a bad thing, nor a detriment to the film itself. In fact, I'd say it's something that makes Nausicaa so unique. Despite only being a fraction of a much larger story, for most people it's still a complete and satisfying story. It was a huge success, still has an amazing legacy, and is up there as one of Studio Ghibli's best films. It's no secret that the Nausicaa manga is underread. Manga in general is just less accessible than anime, and watching it is understandably easier than reading, so the fact that the film exists and is an easy way for people to access such an incredible story, even in a shorter form, is still really great in my opinion. That being said, I do have to acknowledge the high level of quality in the manga itself. Miyazaki is most well known for his direction and animation, but he originally did want to be a mangaka. He worked on such as Toei's Puss in Boots and The People of the Desert story that I mentioned earlier, but that was more of a graphic novel if anything. So seeing him tackle a detailed, fully fledged manga is really interesting. He puts the same level of detail as he does in his animations into these still drawings. And because they're monochromatic, unlike most of his concept art which uses watercolor, he plays around a lot with the line work to create texture and lighting. And you can see how his work as an animator and storyboard artist translates into the manga medium. He'll dedicate multiple pages sometimes to single movements, putting emphasis on them, almost like keyframes in animation. And he really emphasizes movement to create good reading flow from panel to panel. You can easily see how these panels would be animated just by reading it. It almost feels like they are animated at times. It's such an engaging read and gets addicting. I've read it 3 times now, all the way through, and it's hard to put down. There are such tense scenes and incredible emotional moments. For me, it was the first manga that made me cry. Even without voice acting, music, and movement, it achieved this just through the art and storytelling alone. To me, that's a real testament to its quality. It's interesting to see someone like him who's really mastered his craft in animation jump back and forth between the two mediums and how they influence each other. It's so rare for there to be a story that has both its original medium and its adaptation be well received and beloved classics of their own respective mediums. It's even rarer for this to still be the case and have the adaptation differ from the original story in a considerable way, and then also that adaptation affect the original story because it's still ongoing. The fact that Miyazaki had full creative control over the manga, and he's very much an auteur when it comes to directing, allowed him to have direct influence over both the original story and its adaptation. That's something very rare in the anime industry since it's rare for someone to be so skilled and proficient in both mediums. Now, I don't have encyclopedic knowledge on anime, but there's only one other specific artist that comes to mind to me that is similar, and that is Katsuhiro Otomo with Akira. He created the original manga that the film is based on, directed the film himself, and then later continued the manga afterwards, very similar to Miyazaki and Nausicaa, but both of these anime stand out and are equally influential in their own rights, so I don't believe it would be fair to compare them to each other. Nausicaa's legacy beyond Ghibli is really immeasurable. A lot of it isn't even direct, but simply by existing it became an influence for so many future mangaka, animators, and storytellers. It's been referenced many times by other stories in a joking manner or even through more direct inspiration. For example, these guys here. Our faithful bird mounts in the world of Nausicaa served as the inspiration for a very iconic yellow bird mount from the Final Fantasy series. This all compounds on the fact that there wasn't really anything like Nausicaa at the time, and there still hasn't really been anything like it since. But all in all, I'd like to thank you for joining me on this little expedition today, and congrats on surviving! We did lose a few people along the way, but hey, it's bound to happen. If you've made it this far, I'm sure you've already seen Nausicaa and are a fan of Ghibli, but if you haven't gotten around to reading the manga yet, I'd highly recommend that you do. It's honestly one of the best pieces of art that has ever come out from the studio and its adjacent productions. The art and storytelling is top-notch, and just grows deeper and deeper as it goes on. We get to see the horrors of war firsthand in all its violence and tragedy, the camaraderie of people coming together to survive, the beauty and mystery of the forest as its secrets quietly wait to be discovered, and the development of a kind-hearted warrior princess in Nausicaa. It is undeniably an epic, and one of the best manga in the entire medium, in my opinion. I wish we got to see more manga from Miyazaki, like his Teppo Samurai story, which unfortunately hasn't seen the light of day. But we are incredibly lucky that Nausicaa exists in the form that it does, and is complete. It makes me a bit sad that we'll probably never be able to see a full adaptation of the manga. It's too long for a film, and I don't think a TV series would do it justice, just because of the smaller scope and budget. But Nausicaa is just so incredibly underread, and even amongst the Ghibli film library, I'd say it should be watched more. Yes, it's old, but that age doesn't detract from it at all. Within the pages of the manga and the frames of the film, there is a truly unique story, a living and breathing world full of incredible characters, deep themes, and beautiful art that complements both of their mediums perfectly. Since the 40 years that Nausicaa was created, it stands out as one of the all-time greats, and there truly is nothing quite like Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Hello again, Cameron here. I'd just like to say a big thank you for watching this video. This is by far the biggest video I've ever made on YouTube, with almost 200 original drawings, 40 minutes, and I've been working on it since about June. It's been a whopper, to say the least, but I've really enjoyed it, and if you enjoyed it, then it would mean the world to me for you to leave a comment, or like the video, or subscribe to see more of this kind of thing. I'd love to make more deep dive video essay documentary style videos on anime and the arts and Japan in the future. Let me know. Have you read or seen Nausicaa before? What do you think of it? And what is your favourite character? As you heard, I am partial to Kurotoa myself. But despite this being my biggest video, there are still really big things to come for this channel soon this year, so please do look forward to that. And once again, I'd just like to say thank you all for watching, and I will see you on the next video very, very soon.